The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Do you know what lies within nothing?
No.
Do you know where it ends? Do you want to know?
Yes. Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
Hi, Tits Out Brigade. It's me, Anne, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that coming up this Saturday, March 4th, 2023, I'm going to be hosting the first ever live episode of VULGARPIECE Theater. So it's going to be me, Allison Epstein, Lanoa Johnson. We're going to be talking about the 1986 movie Lady Jane, which is about Jane Grey, starring like this tiniest little Smurf-sized baby, Helena Bonham Carter, Cary Elwes from around the same time he was in The Princess Bride, and Patrick Stewart in a wig are the main actors in this movie. I want you all to come and listen. The reason I'm doing this is because we recently celebrated 100 episodes of Vulgar History. It's totally free. It's just like a live stream. You can come and chill out and hang out with us. There'll be a chat there. Anyway, to attend, you go to youtube.com/vulgarhistory this Saturday, again, March 4th. It's going to be at 5 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern. I hope those time zones make sense for you wherever you live in the world. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to it, I'm terrified. So that's coming up Saturday, March 4th. And there's a link to that in the show notes for today's episode. Thank you for supporting this podcast and getting us to this 100 episode milestone. And I hope there's hundreds more episodes to come. Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and today I'm joined by author Molly Greeley to talk about her gorgeous new book, which is called Marvelous. So we're going to talk about all what it's about, the historical setting, the real life people, but what I want to tell you first is there's a quote on the cover of this book from friend of the podcast, Allison Epstein, who is the person who recommended this book and this author and told me that I should read it. And perfect advice. So here's what Allison says about this book. Quote, enchanting. Molly Greeley has pulled off a piece of magic to tell a dazzling love story about the outcast's ache to be cared for and belong. This book broke my heart and put it back together again. So if you need to know anything, any other reasons why you need to read this book, it's got the Allison Epstein stamp of approval. It's also got my stamp of approval, obviously. But I hope you enjoy this chat with author Molly Greeley. Okay, so I'm joined today by Molly Greeley, and your new book is called Marvelous. Welcome, Molly.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I guess I was thinking, I'm like, how do we get into this? Because I want to talk about the real story, but I want to talk about your book. So I think first, can you explain to me what the real story is, like the history, how you came across the story, and then we can talk about how you turned it into a novel.
So I came across this story while I was doing edits for my second book. It was this stray fact on Google that had nothing to do with what I was looking up. I was looking up another stray fact for my second book, but this just Google search result caught my eye that said something about, the true story behind the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale. And I was intrigued, so I clicked it and went down a whole rabbit hole. And it turns out that there was a man named Pedro Gonsalvus and his wife Catherine, who lived in France during the 1500s, and he had hypertrichosis, which meant that his entire face and body were covered in hair. And their marriage possibly was this arranged affair by the Queen Mother of France at the time, Catherine de Medici. Basically because rumor had it she wanted to breed more hairy people like Pedro to have at her court, because back then it was this whole weirdly, royals and noble people back then really loved to have unusual looking people living around them. They surrounded themselves with unusual humans. And it was this kind of power play and this way of looking like they were, rich. And I don't know if it was just that they felt powerful. To be honest, I still have not fully understood why surrounding themselves with unusual looking people was something that made them feel good, but it did. And it's happened all over Europe. And Pedro was one of those people. And supposedly his story might have influenced the original writing of the 1600s fairy tale, the Beauty and the Beast. So I just went down this rabbit hole while I was supposed to be doing something entirely different, and I emerged from it and just felt like, okay, this is the subject for my next book. I have to know more. So they lived in France for a long time until the French Wars of Religion they had to flee France because things were getting really bad there. They ended up living in Italy under the Duke of Parma's protection. And then, basically it was kind of like in Beauty in the actual fairy tale, where he lives in this beautiful palace, but he's kind of trapped there and she's trapped with him. And that was sort of what their life seems to have been like, where they lived in this gilded cage of protection under these various courts, but they didn't have as much freedom as most people would have had back then.
And they did have children, like the real life people.
They had at least 7 children. I only include 4 of them in the book, but they had at least 7, many of whom were also born with hypertrichosis. So they were also born hairy.
And so there's portraits of them in existence. I don't know if they were painted in their lifetime or afterwards.
As far as I know, they were not painted in their lifetime, or they were not painted from life. So most likely there were sketches made from them by artists who then passed those on to other artists who made bigger portraits that were commissioned by various, royal figures of the time.
So we don't know exactly what they looked like. Like the portraits that I've seen, they kind of look like Chewbacca.
Kind of, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's possible that that's accurate. Because there have been very, very few people with hypertrichosis over the course of history.
I was going to ask you that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, there are different forms of it. The form that Pedro had is now known as Ambra syndrome, basically named after him, because that's where many of his portraits and the portraits of his children ended up, at Ambra's castle. But there's a form, I believe, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but there's a form where the hair, it does not grow as long on the face.
Mm-hmm.
And then the form that he had, the hair just kind of keeps growing like it does on our heads.
Okay. So I don't know. I hope I'm not being offensive to people who have this condition, but the portraits of them, I was just knowing they're not painted from life. It's just, I would imagine an artist would be like, okay, what would a person covered in hair look like? Maybe like this. It's
entirely possible. And I don't know. The one thing I found interesting about the portraits is most of them don't have hair on their hands in the portraits, but in the description of Pedro and of his children. So there was a description of Pedro from when he was a boy brought to the French court, because he was brought to the French court in a cage. We don't know exactly how he was taken from his original home in the Canary Islands, but he was taken from there somehow. He was brought to the French court and as a gift to the newly crowned king, Henri II. And there was a diplomat from another country who wrote extensively about this strange little hairy boy who had been brought. And he described him as being hairy all over, including on his hands. And then Pedro's children were described by actually a physician who wrote about them for his own. He basically just had this whole book that he was writing about different conditions, different kinds of people, and he wrote about them as if they were hairy everywhere, including their hands. But none of the portraits show their hands being hairy, which is just, it seems like a choice that was made, or just that it wasn't painted from life.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And I'm so glad to be talking to you about this. And I'm so glad I read the book, because just the other day, I forget if it was on Instagram or on Twitter or something, somebody, like I follow all these different history accounts or people who are fans of history, and somebody posted like, oh my God, look at this picture. And she'd found one of the portraits of, I think, him and one of the children. And they're just like, what is this story? And I was like, Molly Greeley actually wrote a book about this.
I think it's just so interesting that this isn't more widely known. I mean, there are a few books written about, nonfiction books written about him, but I had never, and, everything that I'd found that one day when I, went down the rabbit hole was just, Google search results. It was people's blogs. It was, some of it was very interesting. Some of it turned out not to be accurate from what we know of history, but it's not something that's, for some reason, because it sparked my imagination so much, I'm just kind of like, why does no one else know about this?
Yeah.
Why didn't I know about this? Yeah.
No, and that's so interesting. And I don't think I'd ever come across, like, once anyone comes across these portraits, you're like, wait, what is this? Like, this is what's going on. And I'd heard about other people, like I forget, it's like Pierre the Wild Boy, or like I know about some other people who were like brought to French court who like had unusual circumstances. So part of the thing so do you call him in the book, he's Pedro, but he's also known as Petrus. What do you think of him as?
I tend to think of him as Pedro because as far as we know, that was his name before he went to the French court. And that's something that in the book I wrestled with as a writer. And then also I kind of had him wrestle with it himself because he was known by many names. I mean, he was known as a wild man. He was known as, basically Mr. Savage, Monsieur Sauvage. My French is terrible. I chose to have him end up thinking of himself mostly as Pedro because that was, the name that was given to him as a baby. But for all I know, maybe he embraced Petrus. I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, names are sort of more, just from my research, names were more fluid back then in a lot of ways. Yeah. Like if you moved from France to Italy, suddenly you change your name.
And that was an interesting thing that I found. One of his sons, who was named Henri after probably two different French kings that were at the court during Pedro's time there. He was called Enrico when they moved to Italy. And I mean, just apparently he railed against this. Like Pedro's biographer, his Italian biographer, found, these documents where he kept wanting to be called Henri and not Enrico. And everyone was like, you're in Italy now.
Yeah.
this is your name. Yeah.
So you came across this fascinating story. And then in deciding to turn it into a novel, like what was that process like? Because I mean, obviously you're coming to it from the Beauty and the Beast sort of angle. Like you wanted to include him and his relationship with his wife. And how much is known about the wife? Like my sense is like very little.
Very, very little. We know her name. We know that I don't even know that this is positively true, but from what I read, it sounds like her father really was a merchant, just like Beauty's in the fairy tale. Mm-hmm. So he was probably a wealthy merchant because he was known to the Queen of France. And that's really all we know about her. We know that she was significantly younger than he was, which wasn't unusual at the time for marriages, but we don't even know her exact age when she was married. So, just very little. And we know possibly what she looked like from her portrait, if that's accurate.
So in that instance, like as a fiction writer, like you were able to sort of create a character, without being really constrained by much other than knowing her father's a merchant. Mm-hmm. She's probably very pretty.
Exactly. Yeah. And with her, I think it was freeing to write from her perspective because I felt a lot more tied to history with Pedro. Mm-hmm. And with, again, we don't know a lot about him either, but from from what I had read about him, I wanted to stay as true to that as I could. But with her, it was, I mean, we don't know anything about her, how she felt about being married to him. We don't know, I mean, any of that. And so I felt free to kind of assume, that it would be hard in the beginning. And then I knew that I wanted them to fall in love in my story. But in history, we don't know if they did. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, and I want to make sure that everybody knows that for who haven't read the book yet, that it is like very much a love story. Is like I think it says in the book somewhere, it's like the real story of Beauty and the Beast or something. So like you go into it like knowing it's not just about this man and this peculiar circumstance, but they're forced into this marriage. Well, I mean, I guess a lot of aristocrats, like the king and queen, were like, "You're going to marry her." Like that's just kind of what happened to everybody. So that's not unusual necessarily.
King and queen themselves, yeah. Yeah.
So like in terms of like love stories and the classic story of, people being, there's so many romance novels and stuff of people who are forced into an arranged marriage and then they come to love each other. So it's like, I don't know, it's a familiar sort of situation to be reading about in a book, but you have the added level of what's going on in France at the time. And then of course his condition and.
Yeah. And that definitely puts some constraints on their situation. And that's something that, as far as the, arranged marriage trope, that's something that I mean, I'll read books like that. I enjoy books like that. But in writing about real people, I felt like I wanted to show that, that it isn't necessarily, an immediate love that comes from these situations. And I suppose it can be. But in this case, I wanted to show that it was not easy for either of them. And I think, that goes back to the fairy tale as well, but Beauty was kind of, she was supposed to be a good girl and do what her father said. And so and to help her father, like that was her duty as a daughter. And so she went into this castle with this beast and, was trapped there. But he was also in the fairy tale trapped by his own circumstances. And I think that was very true of Pedro and Catherine, at least in my novel, that circumstances trapped them, but they learned how to make the best of it that they could.
No, and I'm thinking too, I mean, I've never read the classic, like the Beauty and the Beast fairy tale from when is it, from the 1600s?
It was from the 1600s. I'm going to not remember, of course, the exact date right now. I want to say it was the 1640s, but I might be wrong about that. But it was approximately, just a little bit over 100 years after Pedro's death.
So there would have been, just from what I've read about this, just preparing for this interview, certainly some of the illustrations were perhaps inspired by the legend of Pedro and what he looked like.
Yes. And if you've seen the Disney, not the animated version, but the newer live action version, I thought it was weirdly striking how much they made the beast look like Pedro. I don't know if that was, I have no idea if that was remotely intentional on their part or if they even knew anything about Pedro, but there's the two faces next to each other are strikingly similar.
That's interesting. I wonder if, because they were coming at it from a live action, realistic point of view, if they're like, well, realistically, what could this person look like? Maybe they came across the portrait.
Somebody who is a person, but yeah.
But okay, so I'm mostly familiar with the Disney version of it, which ends with the beast turns into, he doesn't look like a beast at the end. He's transformed again. Pedro, obviously, that's not the outcome. That's not possible for him.
Yeah.
Does the original fairy tale end with the beast transforming?
It does.
Okay.
Yes. And it's interesting because in the original fairy tale, I mean, Beauty is not totally happy with her circumstances. And she literally dreams about this handsome prince or handsome young man. I can't remember if she knew it was a prince, but this handsome young man, night after night, she keeps dreaming about him. And she wants him. She doesn't want this beast who keeps asking her to marry him. But in the end, it turns out that the handsome young man is the beast, just, in a different form. And so with Catherine, as she was supposed to be a teenage girl when she got married. And I imagined that she might have dreamt of something different for herself, as many teenage girls do. But she didn't have, she had her husband and he wasn't about to transform physically. She just had to learn who he was inside.
And so part of the thing that I found really interesting about your book, and I think this is based on, well, you were saying you really stayed close to history in terms of writing Pedro's character, was how educated he was. Can you talk about that? Like the real life him, but also in the book? He wasn't kept in a cage as like a zoo creature. Like he was
No.
treated just like any other young man, effectively.
Exactly. And I mean, he was brought to court in a cage. He was brought, I believe he was naked when he was, that's how it is in the book. And I believe there was one account of it that did sound like he was not wearing clothes when he was brought to court. And he was presented to the king, and the king started talking to him and realized that he could speak, because they had kind of assumed that this was some sort of animal human hybrid and some kind of wild creature. And the original thought was to put him in the menagerie with the animals.
Mm-hmm.
And then the king was just absolutely delighted when he found out that Pedro was a person who could speak, and decided that he would be educated like with his children, using, the same kind of tutors. And so he got a gentleman's education. He learned how to fight. He learned how to speak Latin. He learned mathematics. It was just that he wasn't expected to do as much with that education necessarily as a nobleman might have.
No, and that's so interesting to me, just because I think I had been conflating his story with, and again, I don't remember the name, but it's like Pierre the Wild Boy or something, the Wild Boy of some, anyway, he was someone who maybe had some sort of like autism level, like he was someone who wasn't capable of being educated, and he acted sort of more like but then I was reading this book and I'm just like, wait, Pedro is just, that's not his issue. Like he just has this hair situation, but otherwise he's capable of anything.
Yeah, otherwise he's just a person. Yeah, just without any. One interesting thing is that I did come across, this was after I'd written the book. And so one fun, but not always so fun thing about writing historical fiction is that sometimes facts come to light at inconvenient times.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a possibility that he actually taught a class in a university in Paris, that he was allowed to use his education in that way. At the time that I was writing, all of his biographies and the nonfiction books that I was, reading about him did not mention this at all. And so, but then these documents came to light in the French National Archives, and it was just a very brief mention that made it sound like he very well might have been a professor for a brief period of time. Which, so it's possible that he was able to use his education, and that, possibly could change how he was viewed by the court entirely. I mean, so I just, and yet his biographer had all sorts of instances in which Pedro kept wanting work and was not given work.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to use his mind and was not given the opportunity. So I'm not with this kind of history, there's so little actual physical evidence of anything that it's hard to know what the truth was.
Yeah. And so that's just, I think, a challenge for, I don't know if it's a challenge, but just for writing historical fiction, which is what you do, to decide kind of which facts, like you said, they had 7 children and you made it be 4 children. Like you need to change some things just to make historical events become a narrative plot.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The 7 children, I did originally include all of them, and my initial readers were like, we can't keep these kids straight. We just can't do it. So I whittled that down. But
yeah. And then what you know of the children, like I think it's similar in your book, like they were mostly inherited his condition, except for maybe 1 or 2 of them.
Yes. Yeah. So there was one son who we don't know whether there were 2 sons. There's one that we don't know whether he was hairy or not. He was Paul, and he's not included in the book. It doesn't sound like he was hairy because there's no mention of it in the record, but it could just be that there's no mention. And then Hercule, who died as an infant, there's also no mention of that, whether of his condition one way or another in the record. So, and there were also, again, in those archives that came out, there are also a couple of other children who may or may not have existed, who that there is mention of their births, but we don't know how long they lived. There's no mention of them after that, and that was in France. So it's possible that they also died as infants. It's also possible that they were conflated with some of the other children, because one of his daughters, Antoinette, has various names throughout the record, and it's hard to figure out who is who when you're going through this stuff.
Yeah. Oh, actually, can we talk about Antoinette? I think that's she's one of the ones who there's a portrait painted, and I think there's been some interest in her as a historical person. And your book starts off with mentions of her, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. She fascinated me throughout the entire writing process. To be honest, in an earlier draft, I had her voice as one of the voices, and it got a little bit too complicated. But she was at the age of, I believe, around 8. She was given as a gift to another noble person in Italy. And after that, she disappears entirely from the record. And so we don't know what happened to her. But that was one thing that just like stuck in my head, was that, even though Pedro was educated, and even though he was, given, allowed his humanity to a certain extent in the French court, his children were still treated as objects to be traded. They were still, and I mean, I just can't even imagine being a parent. I mean, noble children at that time were often kind of fostered out to different courts, but this felt different to me. This didn't feel like something like they could come back. This felt like they were being given as gifts, as if they were dogs or horses or something like that. And that just broke my heart to think about it. And so, yeah, Antoinette was one of those children who was given away.
Yeah. So just the way you describe that, I'm just kind of struggling to think, because I know that there was noble children would be sent somewhere else to be raised, people's marriages would be arranged, but there is, so in that sense, it's similar to the stories of other people in that time and in that place, but there is this weird, uncomfortable tinge about it when it's him and his family, and it's because they were sometimes treated like people, but also treated as kind of pets who could talk.
Yeah, pets is a good word, I think. Yes. And I think that was one of the struggles I had in writing it, was trying to figure out which side of the line to fall on, because it does seem from all of the historical records that they were seen as both. They were seen as people and also as not some fully. And I guess for Pedro in particular, it just felt like, he lived most of his life at these courts. And I can't really imagine trying to find your own place in the world when people don't even fully grant you, your humanity, and to watch your children go through the same thing. But of course, this was also a different time period, and people had very different ways of viewing the world. There was a lot of superstition that we don't have now around conditions like hypertrichosis. And so, I mean, that added a whole other layer where in some ways the courts might have been the safest place for them, because there was genuine fear of werewolves back then. And I mean, thousands of people killed for being werewolves and in France. And if you look like what someone might imagine a werewolf to look like, there's probably some safety in being at a court where among people who value your hair rather than or fear it.
Well, and knowing that the king had brought him there, that the queen arranged his marriage, that's so interesting. Yeah, there'd be a level of protection there. Whereas if he had been born, or if he just was in the countryside or something, superstitious peasants or farmers likely wouldn't have treated him as well. And now we're just going to take a break for a word.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hello, my name is Alison Larkin, and I'm a writer, comedian, and narrator and host of the Jane Austen podcast. This podcast brings Jane Austen's stories to the 21st century, along with commentary from me and conversations with fascinating people who all share a love of Jane Austen. And of course, we had to start with none other than Pride and Prejudice. So join me as we embark on a journey through some of the most wonderful stories I know. The Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin is available wherever you listen to podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
From our sponsors. And we're back.
Well, I mean, and it's such a tricky thing because they did end up living in a village at the end of their lives. The entire family lived in an Italian village that was still part of the Duke of Parma's vast lands, but they were away from court for a lot of the time toward the end of their lives. And one of the sons ended up becoming a pretty successful businessman in that village, but it also sounds like they were looked at quite a bit with suspicion. But again, because there's so little record, it's possible that people accepted them.
Yeah.
But, actually, some people did because at least Catherine was godmother to multiple children in that village. And Pedro was godfather to not as many as Catherine, I don't believe, but he was actually named godfather to some of the children in the village, which makes you think maybe he had some respect there.
Yeah.
The whole thing... I would give a lot to be able to, travel back in time and actually see how they were treated.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting. And I do want to emphasize for people, again, who haven't read the book isn't like oh, poor me, like I'm covered in hair, my life is so sad narrative. It's just like, no, that's what he looks like. There's that extra level of it. There is this love story. And it's really just about who he is as a person and who Catherine is and their relationship. And can you also talk about, so like there's this fascinating thing happening between them as a couple and what is that like and kind of the Beauty and the Beast situation. But in the backdrop of it is this like extremely chaotic historical moment. Can you talk about that?
Yes. long historical moment, the French Wars of Religion that were very bloody. And that was one of those things that I struggled with because I didn't want the history to completely overshadow the personal story of this couple, but obviously it would have affected them.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it was this time, for people who don't know, when the Catholics and the Protestants in France were just at each other's throats. The Catholics were in power. The kings at that time were Catholic, but they had been persecuting Protestants, and there were these sham trials where Protestants, were tried for heresy and then ended up being put to death. And Protestants finally started pushing back. And this was decades of this back and forth. And there were different factions that kept trying to get back and to get into power as the Catholic kings in this one particular line kept dying. And then a new one would take, a new brother would take, the place of the one who died. Each time it seemed like, the different factions saw it as a new opportunity to try to, to gain total control. And then in the book, there is what was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which happened when the Catholic daughter or Catholic sister of the current king, of the king at the time, was betrothed to the Protestant Prince of Navarre, which was a province very near France. And so at their wedding, all of these Protestant noble people were invited into Paris for this wedding, and then ended up being slaughtered. and who was responsible for that. And it's very complicated. No one is 100% sure who gave the actual order for this to happen. But it set off this chain of absolute slaughter of Protestants by Catholics that went on for possibly weeks throughout the countryside. Sounds like a very terrible time to have been alive in France. But
I'm just imagining you coming to write this book. You're like, okay, he was born here and his children were born at this time. So like, what was going on in the world? Like, oh no.
Yep. That was honestly probably verbatim what my thought process was. Yeah.
Because it's like around the same time as they're starting to have children, like this massacre happens and you can't not talk about it because they're at the royal court. But so what was that like to sort of balance including, and I think you do a really good job of it, like the book is very much their characters' stories, and you just kind of give a taste of like, here's what's going on, and that affects their lives, obviously, but it doesn't overwhelm it. How did you kind of balance that?
I guess the way I thought of it is that they would have been slightly insulated, not from the massacre itself, because that happened at court, or it began at court, but they would have been insulated from a lot of what was happening because they lived at court, and because at that time, a lot of these skirmishes between the Catholics and Protestants were happening elsewhere. And so they would know about them. It would affect them to some extent, but kind of, I mean, I feel like unless you are in the middle of a conflict, like actually in the thick of it, it's easy to go about your life, even if you know terrible things are happening. Even now, we hear about terrible conflicts happening around the world and are affected by them, but it's also possible to continue living
right.
if you're not directly involved. And so I guess that was how I thought of it for them, was that they would have been probably very concerned about this, but also would have been living their lives and would have been concerned with the immediate problems of court life and how best to raise their children in this environment.
Right. It's really just focusing. And I guess that's what the book does too. It's like, this is their story. And when these events become unavoidable, then they talk about it. But every day, there's other historical fiction books that I have read where the authors find a reason for the characters to talk about. It's like, oh, did you hear what's happening in the American colonies? And it's like, why are they talking about this? Like, that's not, but it's just a way to be like, just so you know, this is the same time as this was happening. So I think your book really is very much their story with a flavor of this. But that was what I was really wondering, like when there was so much stuff happening throughout their entire lives. But I get if there's so much happening like there is with us, it's like, well, that doesn't stop you from having a relationship and like living your life.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, now it hasn't been on the same soil. It hasn't been on U.S. soil, but the United States has been a, war for most of my life. It feels, on and off. And it's something that I certainly think about, and, depending on what the circumstances are, worry about. I've known people who've, been actually involved in these wars, but day to day, it's not, because I'm not presented with this constant barrage of it. I feel insulated from it many times. And so, I mean, I feel like court life in many ways was designed to insulate the noble people from the hard realities of life. I mean, because life was hard back then, but at court, they had these constant amusements. They had, bread and circuses, but for the noble people, it was just kind of this way of keeping spirits up, I guess, is how it felt when I was reading about it, that they would plan all of these amusements that were more and more expensive and more outlandish. And meanwhile, their people are fighting for something that the people probably weren't that worried about, but that the king wanted, them to, conscripted them into. It just felt like court life was going to be very insulating until it came to their doorstep.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and just from other historical authors who I've spoken to, and just let me know if this was your experience as well. Like, you did so much research and you learned so many facts and so much interesting stuff. You're like, I want to put it all in my book. But then it's like, no, it needs to be like a novel.
Yeah.
Were there any interesting things you wanted to put in that you had to, well, I guess you mentioned there was other children that were there. There's other points of view. But like, what was some interesting things that you wanted to put in, but they just didn't fit?
Oh, goodness. I wanted to put in more about Catherine de Medici because she is just such an interesting, fascinating person in history. And I had more originally in there, but it felt forced in the book because realistically, they probably were not intimates of hers. They were not people who would have hung out with her on a regular basis. They would have been in, receiving rooms where she was, but they wouldn't have been the ones spending a great deal of personal one-on-one time with her. And so, but because she was this woman who was, throughout history has been hated, and yet she was also a mother who very much cared about her children. She tried, at least for a while, to stop these wars between the Protestants and the Catholics. She wanted peace, even though she was Catholic and very religious herself. And so I put a little bit of that in there, but I desperately wanted to put more because she just fascinates me.
Well, and that's the thing too. I don't know, it's similar to like, and the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre was happening at the same time as the story. It's like, they're in the court of like Catherine de' Medici, like one of history's most fascinating people. But you're like, exactly. I guess like with the historical facts, yeah, it's like you can't get distracted with how cool she was.
Yeah, and they, and she doesn't show up in the story. I mean, she's there as her, the last few decades of her life. There was even more of her history that I wanted to include because, I mean, just her childhood, her young adulthood, it's all very interesting. But yeah, but it had nothing to do.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I am going to be doing an episode about Catherine de' Medici later on my podcast. And I already know it's going to probably be like 3 hours long. Like,
I will be listening.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to say about her, and I'm excited to get the chance to relate because she's been on the periphery of some other stuff I've talked about, and the exact same thing. I'm just like, okay, I don't have time for this right now, but like one day I will focus on her entirely. I wanted to ask you as well. So you've written, is this your third book? I think.
Third.
Yeah. And so your first two are sort of inspired by Pride and Prejudice, right? Mm-hmm. Like taking a character and expanding what their world was like. So what was, like, can you compare the difference of like researching that world with researching the world of Marvelous?
So for the Pride and Prejudice inspired books, I guess that was a time period that I was more familiar with to begin with. Mm-hmm. So that, and there is a lot of interest in the Regency period in England. So there's like a wealth of information about what day-to-day life would have been like. And so that was kind of just a pleasure to research because it was all there at my fingertips. Mm-hmm. And then this, I mean, there's certainly a lot of information out there, but when it comes to day-to-day life, I had a harder time finding things. It was more about, the wars and about, what the kings and queens were up to, which was relevant, but it wasn't all that I was looking for. So I felt like I had to, it was researching just took a lot longer for this. And then also because, the other books were inspired by fictional characters, I had the novels as source material. And that was, canon, I guess, for lack of a better word. Whereas with this, I think I've mentioned his biographer before. Pedro's only biography is in Italian, and I don't read Italian. So I bought the book and ended up having to use a translate app in order to read it. And it was just a very long process.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, so I found a lot of very interesting information and was fascinated by everything I found researching this book, but it was not as easy as the other two.
And I find that really interesting too, that I think you said that you were researching your next book, which I imagine was not going to be this. And then you just got kind of swept away and then down this rabbit hole. And then, so just knowing that your interest in it was great enough that you were willing to get this Italian book and like.
Yeah. The whole thing, everything about it just kind of grabbed me. And it was just this idea of this little boy brought to a court as a gift to a king, and who ends up, being educated and living in this country that's not his, birthplace, and having to learn all, everything he needs to know to fit into this court life, and then being married, and having children who look like him, who are going to be treated the way he was, possibly. Everything about that just pulled at me. Just I needed to explore who this person might have been.
Well, and I think it's really interesting in the book. I hope this isn't like spoilery, but like you said, they have children. And so I found it really interesting, sort of the emotions of both Pedro and Catherine when the children are born, where it's just like, do you want them to look like him? Because that's kind of why they were married. Like, that's kind of what the queen wants them to be like. Or do you want them to look like her? Because then they would have a different life experience. And so I thought that was really interesting. Each time a child was born, the kind of suspense of just like, what's...
Yes. Yeah. And for Catherine in particular, I mean, back then there were so many superstitions. I mean, we still have some of these today, but back then it was incredible how many superstitions there were for what would happen to the baby you were carrying if you were a pregnant woman and you looked at the wrong thing or you thought about the wrong thing. And so, people did think that if you had a hairy child, it was because you had, slept under a bearskin rug or something like that. I mean, it was, so she, tries very hard in the book, not to let her first child be hairy because it will be her fault is what she feels like. If she, she would be forcing this life onto her child because if she looks at hairy things too much. I feel like, pregnancy is stressful enough. That would be a whole other level of responsibility and stress.
Oh, and that reminds me too, just about Catherine and her character, which we talked about a bit, but I thought it was a really interesting choice that in the book, at least it starts off and she's illiterate. When, like, again, currently the most famous version of Beauty and the Beast is the Disney one where she just like loves books and reading. Yes. So was that like, obviously that was a choice you made. Was that based just on what she probably would have been like, a young woman at this time?
It mostly based on that. And also it was a choice because from everything I'd read, he seemed so very proud of his education. And it seemed like just one other thing for them to have to engage with each other on, if they weren't quite on the same level with it. So in some ways, she had many advantages over him. Just being born not hairy gave her advantages over him, but he had this advantage of this incredible education. And he lived at this court where some of the women there were extremely well educated, which was not the norm for the time. But many of the women, or many, especially when he came to court, Henri II was king, and he had a mistress who was very, very well educated. And the king's daughters were educated. And it just seemed to me that if this girl comes to be his wife, it would be just one more thing that they would need to discuss and understand, come to an understanding about, that, she needs to understand that he is a person under his hair, and he would need to understand that she is intelligent despite not being educated. That education does not equal intelligence,
Yeah, I think I was midway through reading it when I was suddenly just like, wait, this is like, it's just, I don't know, to me, again, and I'm going to imagine other readers are as well, coming with the baggage of the Disney film. I'm like, oh, this is like the reverse of the Disney film, where she has to teach him how books are great.
Right, yes. Although in the Disney film, that always confused me, is how this prince didn't know how to read, but the girl from the
even though he had this huge library and he'd been trapped for years, it's like you never read any of those books before.
Yeah.
Oh, no, great point. Yeah. No, so it's such an interesting and such a, I don't know. I'm trying to describe it. It's like moving, your book, but it's also like fun and interesting. Like I want people to not come away from this thinking it's just like, oh, this poor man and his poor life. It's like, that's not it at all.
I didn't want him to be, just a victim, basically. I wanted him to be a full person. And because I feel like his circumstances were extreme, but everyone is born in a certain set of circumstances that they have to learn to thrive within if possible. And I wanted him to, I wanted him to be a full human being, not a victim.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and I think too, like a narrative like yours, it shows anyone who's born with any sort of difference. It's not like you don't wake up every day. I don't wake up every day and think like, well, another day for me and I wear glasses and I have red hair. Right. It's like, that's just your life and you don't think about it. But it's just when you meet someone new, they're like, oh, you have red hair or whatever. Like, yeah. For him, he doesn't wake up every day like, well, this is that's just who he is. And like, so it was almost a benefit that he's around the court where everyone's used to him. So like, he doesn't get I guess he does move later on in his life, but.
He does. But the people who were at court with him, especially, day in, day out, would have been used to him and to other people who were physically different because they were.
Right. Yeah. There's dwarves in this book too.
Yeah. Well, Catherine de Medici, she had an entire retinue of, dwarf. I don't know if dwarf is the correct word now, but that's what the word they used then was. And she believed they were magical. That's partly why she surrounded herself with them. They were supposed to be good luck. And so they clearly, she also took care of them. After her death, she left money for them for their continued care. And so that makes me wonder, did she see them as full human beings, or did she just see them as these little magical people-like figures that, I don't know. The whole thing was fascinating because there was clearly a lot of care given to the people at court who had physical differences and mental differences as well. But I wish there was a fuller record of the actual interpersonal reaction or not reactions. I can't think of it, conversations and the way people, dealt with each other on a day-to-day basis, because it does seem like they were cared for, and yet they were kept at court because of their difference.
Yeah.
That was the whole reason they were there.
It's such an interesting time and place for your book to be set, and for it to have the point of view character be someone like Pedro, who is one of these different people. But yeah, because it's not, it's not like in, I don't know, the 1800s. It's not like a touring freak show. People aren't being kept in cages necessarily. It's just here's all these interesting people who look different. Mm-hmm. And they're here because they're different, but that gives them some advantages in some ways. So it's not, I don't want to say it's a positive thing, but it's not the touring freak show level.
Exactly. It's a very gray area of history, where I guess anytime that you kind of objectify someone based on their appearance, whether it's because they're very beautiful or because they look very unusual, it's definitely problematic. And that's what was happening to these people. And yet they were incredible. They were well fed. They were taken care of even after the deaths of the people who kept them. And that was not a small thing back then, in a time when when peasants were starving. Comfort was not a small thing, but I still can't imagine that they didn't want to be seen as entire human beings and not just oddities.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just such an interesting situation. And I think, again, I understand completely how you came across this, and you're just I have to write a book about this. And I would imagine the more you learn, you're just I super have to write a book about this. There's so much to talk about, and there isn't already a book about him, which I find.
When my original thought was that I would find that there was one. That was,
because the story is right there. It's of course there must be.
Yeah. But there wasn't. There was one written in French, but it was a very different kind of story than what I was writing, and not, as far as I can tell, widely out there. But that was the only thing that I had ever found that was a fictionalized version of his life.
It's almost, I don't know, it's just such a gift, I think, to you to find this book doesn't already exist, and there's just so much to dig into. And it really seems to suit, not having read your previous 2 books yet, but it really seems to suit your style as a writer as well, I think.
I definitely like to delve into people's inner lives and all, and that, so this was rich with, all sorts of situations that would allow me to do that. Mm. So yeah, it did feel like a gift.
So do you have, this episode is coming out just after your book is published. Do you have events coming up? Where can people, do you have a website? How can people know where to catch you?
I do have a website, just mollygreeley.com. And if people happen to live or be traveling to Michigan, I have a couple of bookstore events coming up. And then I'm also going to be, those are in March. And I also am going to be on a panel at the Historical Novel Society Conference in June about historical retellings with several other wonderful writers who have written incredible retellings. So if any historical fiction writers or readers want to come to that, that would be wonderful. I believe there's also going to be a virtual version of that as well.
That's good, yeah. And then where can people find you? You're on social media?
Yes, I'm on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Molly J. Greeley for Instagram and Twitter, and then Molly Greeley Author, I believe, on Facebook.
Okay, yeah, and I'll put all those links into the show notes as well so people can follow you as well. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. I really do want to tell everybody, I super recommend this book. It was such a fascinating, interesting read, but the setting is one that I kind of know about a bit. So it's interesting to just delve into this new corner of French history and to know that these people were people like Pedro were at court when all this other stuff was happening.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
So I just want to remind everybody again that this upcoming Saturday, March the 4th, you can tune into my first ever live stream event, which is going to be a live recording of VULGARPIECE Theater with Alison Epstein and Lana Johnson, and we will be talking about the 1986 movie Lady Jane, which if you want to watch the movie to prepare, it's streaming basically everywhere. Things are streaming. It's, I'm going to talk about this in the live stream, but it's I watched this movie, it was randomly on TV when I was a youth, and it's one of the reasons that I got as interested in history as I did. This movie was very important to me, and I have not rewatched it since then, and I hope it lives up to all of my memories. Anyway, so it's going to be at youtube.com/vulgarhistory this Saturday, March 4th, 2023 at 5 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern are the time zones of it. And in the meantime, you can always reach out to me using the form at vulgarhistory.com. You can also email me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com with suggestions of people to talk about, etc. Oh, and I wanted to also tell you that next week, which is March 8th, we will be kicking off season 6. There's something about Mary, Queen of Scots. So that's all. It's all happening. Everything's happening. You can also follow the podcast on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod and on TikTok at Vulgar History. And also you can support this podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter, where for $1 a month, you can get early ad-free access to all of our episodes. If you pledge $5 a month, you get access to bonus episodes of VULGARPIECE Theater, which is where I talk about costume dramas with Alison Epstein and Lana Johnson. We've got so many exciting movies that just came out to talk about. We're doing the Lady Jane event on Saturday. And then the upcoming months, we're going to be talking on that. We're going to talk about Corsage, the new movie about Empress Sisi, which is available on Apple TV+. We're going to be talking about Chevalier, which is a new movie about Chevalier St. George, who I talked about with Maya Dean in the Chevalier Dayon episode. The Woman King, starring Viola Davis. We're going to be talking about that. Anyway, lots of recent costume dramas. It's an exciting time. Oh, and not that we're talking about this on VULGARPIECE Theater, but in general, just so you know, there's a new series or a docu-series on Netflix called African Queens or Queens of Africa, Njinga. Anyway, look it up. Just look up Njinga on Netflix. It's executive produced by Jada Pinkett Smith, and it's this amazing mixture of reenactments, but also experts, experts on African history. Not a lot of these documentaries are British white people. This is people from Africa talking about Njinga and her influence, and it's great, and you should all watch it. And I'm so excited to have Njinga content out in the world so more people can learn about her. Anyway, I have a merch shop, which is at vulgarhistory.store, and when you are there, you can always use code TITSOUT for free US shipping, or TITSOUT10 for 10% off. Exciting things are happening. Tits Out Brigade, thank you for being here along with me on this journey. I'm really excited for season 6 to kick off next week, and until then, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Talmor, Sheshin Marachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Ah, the web tore. Those that both creators and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's that, Silly? This is how you deal with weird!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket's in trouble, Akasa! Can we turn on the windshield remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.